Welcome to Agile to Agility Podcast with Milan Bajic.
Major show alert!
The very first value we wrote is individuals and interactions.
Let's take this to another level.
All right. The recording is in progress. So what I thought we could start with for this podcast and this session is maybe Michael and Glenda and Marie, if you could first, I know a little bit about how you guys first met, but I don't know if I know all the details. So how did you guys meet? Maybe we can start with that.
Well, it was a big synchronistic accident. It happened at Agile 2019. And Marie and I, who didn't know each other at the time, went into the session, both into the session with Glenda. Do you remember what session you were doing, Glenda, then, by chance?
I'm sure that it was problems to patterns or something like that. Practical applications of HSD. I don't remember the title of it.
And I had heard about Glenda, but I hadn't I hadn't seen a presentation by her, hadn't met her, hadn't read her book, Adaptive Action, and was very taken with it. And we ended up having I really liked her, what I would describe now as its quadrant complexity kind of language or view, and wanted to contrast it with a we quadrant view of complexity, more of a constellation kind of a thing. So I talked to her about doing a workshop or I don't know what it would be, but anyway, we had a really interesting collaboration, like right from the beginning. And meanwhile, Marie, what was your perspective on that?
So this was my first time at an Agile event, and Agile 2019, of course, is like, what in the world is going on here? Total, in a way, overwhelming, but also, perfect for my sort of ADD kind of nature. And anyways, I saw Glenda's an HSD in the list of chats, and I just thought, well, that seems interesting. I mean, I had no idea really what that was. And I thought, I'm going to go and sit in on that. And I did. And I watched and I was like, this is fantastic. Like, this is fascinating. This really resonates with me. And what the work that this person's doing, there's something there. What's going on? And at the same time, Michael Spayd was in the room and he had asked a question. And I thought, now that was a good question. Who's that? And anyways, so that's where. How about your perspective, Glenda? Do you remember it at all?
Well, human systems dynamics had been kind of playing around the edges of Agile for a long time, and there had been many Agile practitioners and teachers who had come, and coaches who'd come into the HSD community. And at that point, Jeremy Lightsmith was on our board, and he had said, why don't you come to Agile 2019? I said, okay, great. And so it was a dialogue between him, who is an innovative Agilist kind of person who's kind of pushing the edges of Agile in many ways. He was the one who invented coffee.
Oh, lean coffee.
Lean coffee. And so he and I were talking about theory and practice. And the thing that was most exciting, and this is continuing with our collaboration, is the deep theory roots and deep practice roots, and people, each individual standing at that boundary themselves, managing that in their own ways with their own clients. And so it's just been really, really interesting to dive into the Agile community. And part of that for me is the integral approach to the way people see and think about and talk about things. And so they both seem to be really useful. And so we had that initial conversation, and then came COVID. And we had an ongoing kind of in and out conversation. And then Marie decided to come and get certified, and Michael decided to like, oh,
I
that
got
sounds
jealous.
interesting.
I got jealous and said, I'm going to do it too.
Fear of missing out, moment. And so then our conversations continued, and we began to write a little bit together. And this Dragons program came out of one of your master's classes. It was something that I'd been wanting to talk about for a long time, and the Dragons had been growing but had not found an audience. And so it's just been really interesting to develop this program with Michael and Marie about the Dragons in that context. So so it has continued as it began, as a series of delightful discoveries.
Nice. Maybe a couple of questions that come to mind. First, like, what was your when were you introduced to Integral, Glenda? And were you introduced to it prior to meeting Michael and Marie, or
Good question. Back in the late 1980s, when I was first beginning to work with complexity, I was desperate to find someone else who was thinking and talking about the things that I knew needed to be thought and talked about. And so I read a whole range of things across a complexity spectrum. And so I read some Wilbur at that point. And I thought it was interesting. My background in the philosophy of science kind of gave a nod to that work. And so I've known about Integral for a long time. And then Marilyn Hamilton was at Royal Roads for a while when she was doing her Integral City work. And she had asked me to come and be a part of her summer program there. And so I'd learned a more kind of practical side of it from Marilyn. So I'd known about it for a long time, but had never dived deeply into it, and had never collaborated with someone for whom it was kind of central work. So this has been an interesting adventure.
And from my side, I think it was in the very first presentation, Glenda talked about the four truths: subjective, objective, normative, and complex. Which I was like, well, that's the quadrants. That's the four quadrants. So it was like, she didn't develop it from the point of view of integral per se, but it was integrally aligned or consistent or something like that. I recognize that right from the beginning, that this makes sense to talk about it in an integral context.
And this world of complexity has just been really interesting, the kind of sociological development and conceptual development of the work since the late 80s, because we're all kind of talking about the same thing, but we can't really get our arms around it. So Jack Cohen, who wrote the Figments of Reality and a couple of other books about complexity, he was a reproductive biologist. And he and Ian Stewart, who was a mathematician, had been writing for a long time about complexity. Really lovely work together. But they decided, after 10 years, they decided from their two perspectives, they're never going to be able to describe it. And so he brought in a fellow who was a system software developer from the RAND Corporation, and me and Jack met for a weekend to try to describe it from a computer algorithm perspective, from a biological perspective. And we walked around it, and we still couldn't talk about it. So I've begun to think about, and I think this is the way that Integral stands, is that there is a reality that is unbounded, nonlinear, high dimension, that has been the world of spirituality and arts for a very long time. And we're wanting to take another view at that it. And so as we describe it differently, it's almost like having, if it's love, we have all these different ways of describing it. So here's a haiku, and here's a Shakespearean sonnet, here's a 600-page novel, or here's whatever. But we're talking about the same reality. We're just focusing on different facets of it, using different frames, using different languages, using different tools, whatever our discipline is that comes to it. And so I see us kind of as circling this reality and pointing to it. Sometimes we're pointing at the same things, sometimes we're pointing at different things, but the most important thing is that we stay in dialogue so that we don't lose any of those facets, because the thing is all those and more. So that's one of the reasons that we try to stay open.
That what Glenda just described is a very integral approach. So what Ken calls a flatland approach is when people reduce that only the right-hand quadrants have truth to them, and the left-hand quadrants, I and we, the subjective and intersubjective, are all reducible to the right hand. That's nonsense. I mean, that's just not true. And even if so this idea of keeping dialogue and appreciating different perspectives gives you different information about the world. And you can't eliminate the right-hand quadrants any more than you can eliminate the left-hand quadrants, or you're going to be missing something substantially. You can do that. People do that, but that they lose information when they do.
So let's maybe spend some time on that. And I want to bring in then spiral dynamics on top of HSD and integral. And how much is that then cognitive load or cognitive limitation for humans to deal with complexity? I mean, Glenda, you mentioned like how like we're trying to hit it from different angles, like we're always looking at it from, but over the last, I mean, how long have people tried to define complexity? And we've struggled to have a unified perspective and unified voice. And my question to you is, how much does that has to do with limitation of our cognitive capacity and how we think as humans? Do you think that's limiting us?
Yeah.
We think of ourselves as the smartest species, that we know everything or that we could know everything, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So it's a really interesting question. So there's the whole thread of Piaget and others who are kind of talking about the organic development of the human consciousness and that kind of learning and development path, that I think spiral dynamics captures that in a really interesting way. And then there's the idea of it's not a limitation of our capacity, it's a limitation of our language. And that we have language and social interactions and institutional structures and all of these patterns that we live in our context are locking us into a particular way of thinking. And that there's a paradigm shift that needs to be had, and that we can do that not by making the people smarter, changing how they do things, but by giving them language and tools that allow them to function on the other side. And so it would be easy to think about those two as opposites, right? Either it's the language and everybody's capable, or some are capable, some are not. We need to get them ready. But I don't think it's either or. I think that there are truths in both of those sides. And that as we're helping ourselves and each other and others into a way of seeing it, sometimes it's helpful to think about it as an individual or a group that has already practiced this. So they've already demonstrated the capacity for it. And I can do that without judging them. Oh, they're whatever color they are. But we can instead say, what if they're seeing things through this lens? How can we reach them? So is that an okay non-answer to your question? Yeah. And I'm curious about how Michael sees that as well.
What I would say about the spiral dynamics and
by the way, we don't have to necessarily use spiral dynamics. All I'm saying is
it's helpful.
I'd like to.
Oh, that's good. That's good, Milan.
How much is our cognitive, like for instance, even like is the relationship between us being comfortable, let's just say, with something like certainty, uncertainty, with our cognitive capacity?
I wouldn't call it our cognitive capacity per se. There's some of that, like moving from concrete to formal operations does change how you can think. But more, I would say it's worldviews that are embodied in that are systems of thinking. They're whole patterns that fit together into a worldview. You know, traditional worldview. HSD has three types of change: static, dynamic, and dynamical. And those correspond pretty clearly to the altitude. That, you know, static change you would see in a blue or amber organization, typically. And a dynamic you would see in an orange or maybe a green organization. And dynamical, which is real complexity, which is where you really see the uncertainty that you can't control the change. That's not going to be in a predict and plan mindset. Predict and plan is not going to be okay with that. They're going to reject that as a viable option, and they're going to push you into making better estimates, or, you know, getting a better plan, or managing the plan better, or whatever, because that's the worldview meme typically. It's not that they couldn't step out of it; they could, but they tend to not. So those three kinds of change correspond very nicely to the altitude.
Yeah. And that corresponds to what Glenda is saying around the language as well, from that perspective. Marie, what are your thoughts on all of this?
Yeah, thanks, Milian. I want to interject just a little bit, but what this brings up for me anyways is like the dragons, because in the dragons, trying to present one of them to someone who's just had a life experience and is organizing their life in a certain environment anyways that has a particular approach to the way that, like, time, for example, works, that for them to try to make the leap over to a different perspective of time is a challenge. It's not, and again, it's not like they're not capable of doing it, but they've never had experience with it yet.
Maybe just I'm thinking, like, we mentioned dragons a couple of times.
We should probably say what they are.
For those of those people listening that are not familiar with dragons, you guys want to give us a full overview of the idea behind the dragons?
Yeah, a bit of the history. So there's a group that's called the Society for Chaos Theory in Psychology and the Life Sciences. So this is an academic organization that started back in the early 1990s. And they all come from various areas, and they're all academic researchers, and they come together every year and share their research. And even though they've existed for so long, there are only maybe between 80 and 100 active members. And so they hit a major anniversary. And I've been involved with them off and on through the years. So the guy who's the president and founder of it, Steve Guastello, called me up and said, Glenda, we wonder if you'd come talk to us, do a keynote about why is it taking so long? We've been at this 20 years. Oh, at that point, it was 25 years. We've been at this 25 years. And still we're at the edges of our disciplines, at the edges of nobody will publish our research still. Why is it taking so long? So as I prepared for that keynote, I realized there were some mental assumptions that we make in the modern world about nature, about each other, about
change,
and that they simply don't hold on the other side of this paradigm. Things like time being on a line, things like change being like a vector, things like the ability to plan and predict and control, that we should be able to do that always. And so I began to make a list of them, and I had about 18 in that first list, many too many for a keynote. But as I was talking to a friend who was a philosopher about these and how to talk about them with the group, she said, they're like the dragons. And I said, what? And she said, in the ancient world, when they would draw a map of the world, they'd draw what they knew. So the cartographers would get everything they knew as close as they could. And then beyond that, they'd put sea monsters and dragons out in the unknown space, right? And she said,
there be dragons.
There be dragons. Yeah, there be dragons, Your Majesty. And so that was how they became the dragons. And I believe that they are really core to the shift. And yet they come from very different places. They challenge things fundamentally. And so even though I've dropped them in here and there in various talks, this course that we're doing together is the first time I've had an opportunity really to make them front and center and invite people really to face them straight on, rather than just having them kind of lurking at the edges of the map.
And from the point of view of the collective edge, what I think we saw was Glenda's depth of, I mean, she's been a complexity scientist for, I don't want to say how long, but since the late 80s, right? And she has lots of stories about that. So there was some authenticity and some depth of like really being serious. Like we talked to Jim Highsmith recently, all of us, about complexity, complex adaptive systems coming in and being important early in the Agile movement. But I don't know that there was a really deep understanding of what that meant, but Glenda has that depth of like, she really understands that. And the paradigm cross that she was articulating in the Dragons is something, is from an integral point of view, you'd say it's moving into integral mind, it's moving into integral thinking, kind of thing that, not everybody's going to want to believe somehow that it's pushing on those Newtonian and whatever conventional ways of thinking that just are not true, or not the best picture of reality we can get.
It's edgy.
Yes.
But it's also, I think, we talked in the past about, Michael, like, how, and you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, like how sometimes people only look at the left side of the quadrants, integral quadrants, sometimes on the right. And you said I think in a way that HSD and integral are complementing each other because they're looking at the same thing, but from different perspective. And it's,
I mean,
I guess looking at all of it, but it's just more. So maybe, I guess my question is, what have you learned from each other? I guess doing a couple of workshops, and from your perspective, what is the relationship between HSD, human systems dynamics, and integral?
There are a couple of things for me that have been really significant. So early in my work, I rejected the right side very intentionally. I mean, I knew it was there. I knew it was significant. I rejected it in my work because there were many people at the time who were talking about complexity out of a very subjective, very mystical kind of lens. And I thought that was true, but I didn't find it very useful. And so I rejected that side, focused on the other side. My history as a physics teacher probably helped. And through the years, I've known that other side was over there and that there were people there who were doing good work. It just wasn't my work. But we've come to a place in our evolution where it's important that our paradigm transcend that division and be explicit about transcending it. So it's not that we rejected or misbelieved it, just that it wasn't our native tongue. And so in walking in that space, I've worked with several people who do somatic work. I've worked with people who do strictly spiritual work. But this opportunity to work with Marie and Michael have allowed me to explore that intersection in a way that is just quite interesting and fruitful. So theoretically, that's why. Practically, they are just really great at bringing integral into the classroom and using it as an instructional design technique. And so it has been just really fun to work with them as instructors and instructional designers, people who can hold space with that integral intelligence guiding it. And I've learned a lot in that way. So both those things. I don't think I ever told you that, but it's true. You probably knew it, so thank you. But you knew it. You may not have known I knew it, but I've really appreciated that.
Well, and thank you. And what I would say is it's not, I mean, integral is both sides, left side and right side. Exactly. Right. It's for us, or for me in particular, my specialty, just like Glenda's native language is right-hand quadrant, my native language is left-hand quadrant. but there's nothing inconsistent about HSD with integral in the least. It's actually very integrally consistent, or whatever you'd want to call it. And so I already have models on the left-hand side for when I teach enterprise coaches, for instance. I need models on the right-hand side because that's not as much my native tongue. I can appreciate them, but I don't just come up with them. And so HSD has provided a right-hand quadrant, especially its quadrant, language and approach that doesn't deny the left-hand side or marginalize it particularly, but that's not the native tongue of it either. So it's a perfect complement in that sense.
Exactly.
The other thing I really appreciate, and then I'll let Marie take a crack at it, is Glenda is just a really good person. I mean, that's part of why we wanted to, really elevate this work in the Azure community, especially, and more broadly. And she's got a tremendously open mind about, not just shutting down, oh, that's not the way I normally think or whatever, but, really going into an exploratory space that's been very generative for us. What would you say, Marie?
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Michael, that Glenda's approach to complexity and human systems dynamics and complex adaptive systems, and the way that it's explained, and the tools, et cetera, that are involved in there. Anyways, I think that it is the most true to what is actually happening way of approaching complexity. And so to me, it's most important anyways, personally, and as TCE anyways, to elevate that for, of course, just the purpose of giving people what I think are the best options and new ways of making this shift and into complexity and grasping it. And then further, I think I would say that I think that both integral and HSD they give us sort of a language or a dialogue, tools, etc., very different. And like Michael has pointed to anyways, very complementary, but a ways of viewing sort of life and this life experience that I have found very useful in my own literal moment to moment life experience, and a different way of knowing and sort of testing those things in the moment and in, bigger expanses of time and an uncertainty that I've experienced in my own life. So to me, my experience in integral and HSD anyways has given me, I think, a broader view of complexity, and with that information, that knowledge, the tools, practices, etc., then there's a relaxing anyways that I've experienced in navigating life.
So that brings me to a question, and I think I only explored it a little bit with Glenda last time we spoke. I don't know if we spoke, which is coming back to a paradigm and the Thomas Kuhn's cycle. From your perspective, Glenda, if you look at the Agile community, and not maybe just Agile community, but the current business world, what would be the normal science, and I guess as of right now, and where do you think we are? What's happening in this paradigm shift? Because we're definitely, I think most people I talk to would agree that we're in some type of paradigm shift. But using maybe the Kuhn cycle, and I'll put these for people that are not familiar, just so they can reference. But where would you think we are in the Kuhn cycle when it comes to business world, I guess? But
yeah, that's a great question. So I think that the business world, and I'd say this is business world globally. Many things I'd say are true just of the Western world, but I think the business world globally is focused on closed systems, finite games, and conserved quantities. This assumption that if I can't have it, if I have it, you can't have it, and that fundamental assumption drives the business engine. And so to see value as a zero-sum game, to see power as a zero-sum game, to see resources as a zero-sum game, that fundamental assumption holds true in policy and practice and procedure and people and across the business world. I believe that there are people who are beginning to see or can no longer ignore the cost of that. So climate change is a cost of that. Violent extremism and fundamentalism is a cost of that. War, inequity,
right,
injustice, all of those things follow
massive
from
danger.
Yeah, exactly. Follow from that basic worldview. Now, are we ready for the alternative? Well, HSD assumes and is a set of practices and tools and everything that say, what happens if that's not true? What happens if you're working in an open system? What happens if there are lots and lots of important variables? What happens if relationships are nonlinear? That's the world of HSD. Now, I think that there
also known as the real world.
Yes, exactly. The real world for those of us who do not have the power or wealth to stand in the other one and win that game. And so that I think that there are people who are seeing the necessity for something different. They're calling it generative. They're reaching for blockchain. They're reaching for AI. I think people are desperate for an alternative, but I don't think they know what the alternative is yet. So people who talk about generative agriculture, generative economy, generative this, generative that, they can name it, they can imagine it, they can see the, as Kuhn would say, the aberrations that make it necessary, but they don't know how to do it. And that's the passion around HSD. And so in Integral, and you can talk more about where Integral stands, but I think it is people who are seeing the necessity for transcending wherever they are, but not knowing how to get over that threshold and into another way. That's where I think we are.
In the Kuhn cycle, that would be like model crisis. We're not yet in model revolution yet, but in that model crisis. And maybe what emerges from this is the revolution, what you guys are doing. And I've been saying this for years, that what you're doing is that model of revolution. It's just most people are not ready for that. Do you see it that way? And maybe Michael and Marie, what is your perspective from the
Well, so the worldview that Glenda was talking about for business is what in Integral we would call achievement orange, right? I mean, that's win, lose, finite games, transactional business, whatnot. That's both the world of business, and it's also holds far more proportion of the power in the world. Even though it's not distributed in terms of people. I mean, most of the world is actually, at amber or red, but orange is clearly the power center of the world, and there's clearly things that are rejecting that beyond that, but they're so, in terms of spiral dynamic theory, they're so first tier that they argue with each other. So green just vilifies orange, doesn't appreciate or really transcend it. It just gets in a locked battle. And to get to a more second tier thinking, which HSD is for me a very second tier thinking, will create slowly there'll be a black swan event or something probably that shifts things. The pandemic started to be that, maybe was. The conditions are getting laid. If I'm optimistic.
I haven't thought about this before, but I'm interested to see. I just had maybe aha moment, or if we look at the spiral dynamics like this, it's almost like I always thought it's one paradigm, but it's almost layers of paradigms that you have.
Totally.
I think about it too in terms of so pre-modern, modern culture, postmodern culture. Which gets a broader context.
Yeah, there's some paradox living in that I don't really understand. This is another thing about Kuhn's model revolution is that there are paradoxes, things that from one side appear to be paradoxes that are not on the other side. But there's some paradox there that in order to understand the paradigm where we're sitting, we have to put boundaries around it and give it a taxonomy in order to understand it. And when we do that, we lock ourselves in this side of the paradigm. And so this has been an ongoing challenge for HSD. When we talk about HSD in its own language on the other side of the paradigm, like 2% of the population gets it because they've lived it, because they come up with it themselves. Then we have to say, okay, if we frame it on this side of the paradigm with, there are 3 things that we do, 3 tools, and this is how we call them, and this is a list, and these are tools, and these are actions, and all that. What we're trying to do is to speak on this side, but not to lock ourselves into a set of categories and taxonomies that we have to defend. And so that's been our strategy all along.
Like that makes me think of spiral dynamics and what we say, like really, like when you get to the teal level starts looking at things more as less judging, up to green, and it's like you're locked in. If you think about like today, like I joke around, but like agile coaches that are purists, and like Michael said, we shame sometimes the orange. We're locked into that green paradigm, and we think from that green paradigm we're not willing to let go of it and look at it. So what you described, Glenda, to me, and my understanding of spiral dynamics, is being locked each of the from that perspective and not willing to transcend, and
we try to make that transition. This goes back to your question about what is it that moves people. So rather than saying you have to be able to understand that in order to step to the space, we give people tools to do it. So we have a tool that's called inquiry. And the first rule is to turn judgment into curiosity. So no matter who you are, where you're standing, or what you're talking about, the challenge is turn judgment into curiosity. What's a question you can ask in this moment? And so we're hoping that wherever somebody is in the integral space, they'll be able to come up with a question that is respectful. That becomes a challenge, not become a different level in the integral, but it's how do you ask a question that will transform this moment? And so then you're behaving as if you're on the other side, whether or not there's a side.
Awesome. And we could explore this. I'm thinking, like, I want to look at some of the dragons and maybe explore those a little bit as well, and look at it from a perspective of what we just discussed about this paradigm shift. So one of the things that
could I just interject real quick, Million? I'm sorry, but I just want to add to this, what we've been talking about in terms of the model revolution and the paradigms that are locked in there, and ways of navigating. And Glenda just pointed to, of course, one of the tools in HSD in terms of the power of inquiry, but then the other things, tools and practices, are adaptive action and also the CDE model, which of course we go into in depth in the dragons. And I think it's important to be able to look at that whole picture. So I really wanted to presence that for you. So please, pardon the interruption.
Thanks, Marie. That's helpful.
So I tell people it's as if we're sitting down somewhere for lunch and just discussing this stuff. So so feel free to interrupt. I'm interrupting others, so it's all part of the conversation. So certainty is an illusion, is one of the dragons. Elaborate what you mean by that. And also the context of what we've discussed so far.
Yeah, this goes back to what Michael said before about the 3 kinds of change. So that third kind of change, which is dynamical change, is a completely different theory of change than Newtonian moving A to B in a kind of straight line. What it says is the system has lots of parts that are connected to each other at many different levels, and that between them tension starts to build, and the tension builds and builds and builds until the system can no longer hold it, and then it releases, like an avalanche or like falling in love
or earthquake.
Or an earthquake. Earthquake's a great example.
or bankruptcy or product failure.
Yeah, someone once said that's the story of my third divorce. I said probably 1 and 2 as well, but anyway. So that kind of change is the kind of change that we talk about in complexity. And in that kind of change, you can never know what the next avalanche is, whether it's going to be for an individual or a team or an organization or an industry or the world at large. You don't know how big it's going to be. You don't know any of that. You're standing in the midst of a world that can shift that way at any moment, and you're responsible to do something in it. And that's what we mean, that certainty is, you can pretend like it's certain. You can live in a part of the mountain that's more stable than others. You can like invest all of your resources into holding something, predicting it step by step and holding back the avalanche. But that's all an illusion. It's uncertainty of that kind of change is really life as we know it.
So how do we deal with that? Like, I mean, good example of it is like, with plans and like, even like with annual plans and the people being like, a lot of times people are compromising on quality just to meet this perceived or false sense of certainty. So
yeah. Marie just said it. We have 3 things. Adaptive action, which is iterative decision making and actions. What? So what? Now what? So wherever you are, you're just doing that. What am I seeing? So what am I going to do next? The second is inquiry. So you never delude yourself that you have the final answer. You're just constantly turning judgment into curiosity and acting and then moving again. And then the third is being able to see patterns. So understanding a pattern, influencing it, thinking about things as patterns over time and over space, not as things to be moved. And those are the 3 tools that we think give you some kind of capacity or efficacy in uncertainty. So I'm going to pause there and see, because I know on the left-hand side, there are a lot of tools for dealing with uncertainty as well.
I was going to say, and I was going to say Michael and Marie. Now,
that's sounding pretty right-hand side, isn't it?
Actually,
no.
Well, I was just going to say,
inquiry is totally a left-hand thing to me. But go ahead, Marie.
Well, I was going to say, I think that all of these things too, and this is just even related back to Agile, that this is building, these are tools and practices and things like that to help you to build an Agile mindset and to be truly Agile, right, is another thing that I sort of see happening. So that's another shift.
Yeah, looked like you might have been surprised by that, Glenn. For me, inquiry is a left-hand practice because it's a we and I practice about challenging your assumptions, your, whatever, your preconceptions and whatever, which is internal stuff. And you're doing it in a friendly kind of encouraging way without somebody trying to, change you particularly, but create a more open space in your mind.
Willingness.
It's a practice, but it's
it's willingness to have inquiry is the left side, it's the I, but the practice of actually inquiring and inquiring, talking to you is the right side. So
yes, is an it practice, absolutely. Another example of the certainty is an illusion is actually in spiral dynamics. So we can take it that these people are achievement oriented and put them in a box. And that's a primitive understanding of what's going on. It's a tempting understanding. It's like, it's hard to not type people sometimes when you have something that's true, that's useful, but it's really more accurate to say it's more like a probability distribution. It's more likely that somebody with a center of gravity orange is going to act and think in that worldview, but it's certainly not a certainty. And so, Glenda's HSD practices create a different space where people can act in a different way and find out that it works, and the environment is supportive. It's a more second tier integral kind of a space that gets created, and so people can step into that. You don't know what they're going to do.
So now, if we go back to integral, then if I have a leader in a company that has a policy, which would be in the systems down, and they're required to do annual planning. They're required by the policies and the system to pretend that there is certainty. Then now that becomes a limiting factor, even if somebody has a mindset that embraces uncertainty.
Yes, absolutely. The leader wants to take off in a different direction, but the board says, no, you've got to create it. The stockholders say, no, you got to, those are huge orange enforcement mechanisms that make the worldview, they're a stuck pattern.
Yeah.
Yep. And to be able to say, in this world that isn't bounded in zero sum, to say, I can do that. I can write a plan and I can adapt and adjust to whatever emerges.
Yeah.
So those two are not mutually exclusive. They are at any moment, any question, in any place. But you can hold in a system and in your practice, and good leaders do this already. Good coaches do this already. They hold both the discipline of predictability and the power of opportunity, and they dance back and forth between them. And that really is what we're looking for. Not either or, not even both and, but which one, to what degree, when. When I'm talking about R&D, I'm going to be in adaptive action language. When I'm talking to my board, my adaptive action is going to put me in another language.
And it's almost like layering Canavin on top of this and saying, like, when I'm in complicated, there's more opportunity for predict and plan. When I'm in chaotic or complex, embrace uncertainty, or at least from a Dave's perspective, that's how he would look at it too. So it's like at least the way that I look at it is all of these different frameworks are sense-making frameworks in helping me as a leader to make better sense of what my actions and behaviors and things that I do should be. So I don't know if you relate to that, but to me, that's another layer on top of all of this that we've talked about.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things about that is that when you have boxes, box A, box B, box C, box D, that can be really useful, especially when you're first beginning to understand the other side of the paradigm. To have the boxes is really helpful. But my experience in real life is that in a particular moment, there's a continuum from one to the other. All four exist at the same time. I can choose to see it one way or another way, and it can be a third way. So there's not a kind of absolute box in which this fits, and I've got to figure out the box. It's that the world is holding the capacity for all these things at the same time, and there's a continuum. And so I ask myself, where is this current situation? So what are the options available in it? Now, what can I do with that intelligence to shift it? So it becomes much more about the patterns in this moment, which takes us to patterns, not problems.
And also talk about dynamical. It takes you to that dynamical.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So we have about 15, 20 minute max. I know we got, and I want to talk about some of these other dragons. So next one I want to talk about is patterns instead of problems. Tell me a little bit more about that one.
So that goes back to what we said earlier about problems fit in that space where the boundaries are clear, the measures are clear, and the causality is good. So I'm going to solve this problem. I'm going to define it in a way, and then I'm going to solve it. That's great. That is not always possible. You can't fix a team that way. You can't fix a habit that way. You can't teach somebody something new. You can't shift an organizational culture that way. You just can't. The alternative to that is to think about it as a pattern. And a pattern, you can come to know the conditions that are in place to generate that pattern. You can begin to play with those, to shift it a little bit. And so you become unstuck. As long as you define it as a problem, you're stuck. When you see it as a pattern, suddenly you get an infinite number of possibilities. So that's what we talk about in that dragon. And I'm curious about how you guys see that in practice, in Agile, and also in Integral.
Well, Marie, you want to?
I think the only thing I want to say is my MO anyways lately has been there's in a certain perspective, there's no problems, there's only possibilities. So that's
well, and
Michael.
solving a problem is a very finite game, kind of a play, right? It's like you've got to find the problem, like root cause analysis, which in this world doesn't make any sense in a complex world, right? So a pattern helps you understand what's really going on better, and it says certain things will be problems here and certain things won't be problems here, and maybe a lot of it is good, but all you have to do is to do a quick shift and you'll be fine. I'm losing power, so I'm going to go get power real quick.
But that also speaks to the complexity that problems are interconnected, and what we're looking at is the patterns between the problems, and the patterns themselves are exposing the bigger problem and the patterns within the system. And just pointing to one of the problems in the system is not necessarily going to solve the problem because they're all interconnected.
Interconnection is one of the important characteristics of patterns.
Yeah.
Diversity too. I mean, maybe just to bring that, or the difference in energy and diversity. That's also one of the dragons, but that's one of the
This is one of the things that's important about shifting into seeing patterns is that once you see that, you're not focusing on what the boundaries are. You're not focusing on how this is different from something else. You say instead, what are the characteristics? What are the conditions inside this pattern that are causing it to move or to hold still? And those are differences. And so the difference is the thing that is the motivating, sense-making, and action-taking characteristic of any situation. And so if you can look at that, you can zoom in on the differences, then you can find energy that you didn't even know was there and harvest it. And that's what that dragon is about. How do you see and harvest the energy in difference within a system?
And I just want to jump in there real quick. When Glenda says like energy and difference, that this is coming a little bit, I think, from her also a physics background. And there's something about understanding that is that we explore some more, of course, in the course. But I just wanted to interject that.
Well, and it sorry, I just want to say one thing about what you just said. There's a parametric analysis, I would call it, of complex adaptive systems in HSD called containers, differences, and exchanges. And so you just referred to some of that. And knowing that that's where you can shift patterns, that you're looking for what those containers, differences, and exchanges are in any system at any level or any scale of the system, and that's what you use what, so what, now what to apply as a change methodology to try to shift that pattern without the illusion that you're going to control it, but that you can certainly influence it, or you may well be able to influence it. That's the underlying dynamical change management, quote unquote, paradigm.
That's really interesting. And like what's like I've been thinking and doing some stuff around value stream mapping, value stream management, and I'm also looking at typologies. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. And it's really like it's when you look at, first of all, at the value stream, it's and like one of the questions that you ask is how can you leverage differences to move the system forward, right? If you look at the value stream, it's a differences of different skills, different people, cross-functional teams that are part of this value stream network that are delivering value, moving the system forward. Then when I look at team typologies, as far as how they define like patterns for structuring teams, those are patterns to look at. Like, we tend to box things in agile, like do this, do that. And what I like about team typologies is they're really patterns, how you can structure teams. So like all of this to me is making more sense. And a lot of times we have a hard time explaining things like, from a theory or what we're discussing in complexity, how applies everyday work, but it's always there. It's just like seeing it and being to explain it in a way that resonates with people what they're doing. So that was kind of another aha moment for me
Yeah, cool.
Time is not on a line. What does that mean?
Yeah. So
What time is not a line?
this is another characteristic of that world, this side of the paradigm crisis, is that we think that things, reality, marches along this moment to that moment to that moment to that moment to some kind of end point. So it had a starting point as an ending point. That's quite useful when you're doing a project. It's not so useful when you think about a marriage or a team or a customer relationship or a cultural transformation, because it doesn't work that way. It does instead say, and if you go back to thinking about the avalanche, so in a given moment, the avalanche is the accumulation of everything that has ever happened to that material in that time, in that place, in that whatever. All of that stuff feeds in to the characteristic of that mountain in this moment. And in that moment, anything can happen. So there's an infinite number of possibilities that go forward. So it's a manifold. It's all of the history of the past coming into this moment, and this moment unfolding into whatever is possible in the future. And then if we begin to think about time that way, it does several things. One is it gives us a lot more options for action. Second, it makes us not argue about, are we going there or there? Because we realize we can go to both places because we've got lots of possibility. It also helps us be in inquiry about what we're bringing forward with us. And it keeps us from being preoccupied about blaming what happened before. Lets us take a present forward look at issues. So that's the time is not a line. It's a manifold. It's not a line and you're on it. It's a manifold and you're in it. And that, in the first series, that was, I think, the biggest mind blower. Don't you guys?
It was, well, you know what it just was reminding me of is the more spiritual, mystical view of there's nothing but the present moment, and you know, it's denying, or it's letting go of all this story about things and sensing into what's actually true, or what's the now, what now.
And that's tied to the decision making.
Right.
We talk about leadership,
Right.
and decision making. Like, you know, a lot of times in complexity, you're realizing that you want to make the decision at the last possible moment, and you don't want to prematurely, a lot of times, make a decision because it's of that linear. that it's not as linear as you. What about the last one? Precision isn't accuracy. I've seen this one and I've talked about it a little bit, but to me, when I first heard this one, a lot of times we confuse, and there's a saying, you can be precisely inaccurate.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. This one was another mind blower. So one of our assumptions in the current paradigm is that the smaller you get your unit, the more precise you are, the more accurate the measure is going to be. And if I'm measuring the length of this table, that's true. If I'm measuring it in microns rather than meters, it's going to be a much more accurate measure. But in a system that's complex, where there's variability, where there are multiple scales, where there are lots of things going on, where it's unbounded, precision can disrupt you, mislead you. And that what you have to do instead is zoom out and see the parts and the patterns to get an accurate picture of what's true, even though you may not have a very precise picture. So if you think about a pointillist painting, where it's made up of little bitty dots, you zoom in on the dot, that you can say, this painting is red.
Right.
No, this painting isn't red. This painting is a picture of people in a park on a Saturday afternoon. So that's that distinction. And if precision doesn't give you accuracy, then what does? How can you know what's real if giving smaller and smaller units doesn't? An aeronautical engineer said to me once, do you mean it doesn't matter how many spreadsheets I do? I won't be able to convince that leader to do what I think they should do. Doesn't matter how many spreadsheets. I said, that's exactly what I'm saying. More spreadsheets is not going to make your point. Yeah.
And
This is a slight twist, but it reminds me of an old joke when I used to work with real estate people doing building management. This one guy used to like to say, we measure with a micrometer, we mark it with a crayon, and we cut it with an axe.
How's that working for
Mixing
us?
different scales.
Yeah. How's that working for us?
That's the thing. And like I talk about this when it comes to like in agile or in organizations about like estimating, like when is this gonna get done, right? Like you can be very precise, and like when people pick dates, like a lot of times they want a specific date. That's very precise. But rather than giving a range, like it's, you know, be more accurate. So say like you're gonna be done between May 1st and May 30th, rather than I'm gonna be done at 5 p.m. on May 15th. Maybe that's, you know, but it's almost like in complexity, it's all like like as you get closer to the date, you can adjust. But that whole idea of the stack and adapt and validate, becoming more and more precise, I guess, or accurate, more and more accurate with time.
Right. The closer you get, the better the precision is possible.
Exactly.
Right. That's why you do adaptive planning. I don't know if teams really do that anymore, adaptive planning. But when I coached teams, we definitely did adaptive planning. And I used to tell them, today is the stupidest day of the rest of the project. We will be smarter every day that goes forward from here. So be careful what we say we're going to do. Like, we'll know more in 2 weeks.
That's a great image. There's a challenge here, though. Sometimes people think if you can't be precise, then you can't tell when something is better or worse. They think in complexity, and there are a lot of people who make this argument that in complexity, it doesn't really matter. Everything's the same. You know, you can't know better or worse because it's complex. In uncertainty, you just can't know anything. And we say, no, that's not true, because accuracy is still there. It can still be better and worse. You just may not know the exact measure of what it is. So don't let this make you or anybody think that it doesn't matter, because it does. Quality can live in this world, must live in this world.
Awesome. So maybe in closing, and I know you have a workshop coming up, you're doing stuff together. What would you like to leave us maybe with, well, I guess I'll leave it up to you. What would you like to say?
Welcome to the dialogue. That's all I want to say.
I want to say we're doing our second exploration of the dragons starting April 3rd, every other week, basically 2.5-hour sessions. It's and I'm studying the tapes from when we did it the first time to try to learn from what we did and discovering new things. You know, most of it is Glenda providing, you know, information about the dragons, and then Marie and I do some sense making work, exercises and stuff with people, and do a little bit of relating to integral. But it's really fun. It's mind expanding and mind blowing, and I'm really excited about doing it again.
Me too.
We can give you a link.
I think another, just maybe to encourage people to take, I don't know anybody else that's doing what you guys are doing and combining. So it's like, at least within the agile community, it's a unique opportunity to get these perspectives. Yes, there are stuff that people are doing, and you know, in some way along these topics. But I think what you've been doing together and also individually, just as I said, I feel like that's the you know, the next paradigm on what tools that people can be building. So Marie, what about you? What are your thoughts on them?
Well, first, I just want to say, Milian, thank you very much for sharing that reflection, because it's been a hunch that I've had. And so I appreciate hearing it from outside of our circle that you see it. So thank you for sharing that. And then just thank you for creating this space and for the invitation for us to come here and have this conversation, and for the work that you're doing generally.